these videos, I want to talk about the cerebellum. It's a brain structure in the back of the brain. It's part of our primitive brain, meaning it was there first. It was kind of how we functioned before we grew into more advanced humans. And so cerebellum is broadly responsible for the rate, rhythm, and force of what we do. There are several research studies underway and a lot of theorists kind of jumping into trying to figure out what else does the cerebellum do besides regulate rhythm, rate, and force of behavior. Through understanding a certain syndrome developed by Dr. Schmamann, he proposed that there is a cognitive cerebellar affective syndrome, CCAS, and you don't have to memorize that for any good reason, except to know that through his understanding of this particular syndrome, whether you have it or not, and it could be pretty rare, but the point being is in these studies he was able to determine that the cerebellum is more than regulating your behavior, and because that's kind of how we've learned about the cerebellum over time, that we know it is involved in behavior and smoothness of behavior. So, but Schmamann had said that, or is finding, that it's also responsible for emotional regulation. So it's responsible for the rate, rhythm, and force of your emotions, and that kind of takes things into a whole deeper area, meaning if we just talked about behavior for a second, cerebellum's involved in the rate, rhythm, and force of action, right? So if I want to kind of reach over and grab a file, my brain knows exactly how much force to use to grab it. It has a sense of knowing, and there's a couple feedback loops involved in that, and I won't kind of get too far into that. But basically it knows how much force to use to pick this up versus if I were to pick up a pen or a pair of glasses or my phone, the cerebellum adjusts to the material, adjusts to what it's trying to do. And there's certainly more to it, but in a general sense, that's what it's about. As Schmamann is proposing, it's also responsible for rate, rhythm, and force of emotions, meaning it also supervises how much force do you use when you express your emotions. Are you over responding emotionally? Are you under responding? You know, someone who is dysregulated in their emotion might be in a given situation that would call maybe relatively minor, but then they're the ones who, and we're likely talking about smaller children now, but they're the ones who would be throwing themselves on the floor and throwing a fit for an hour or two over something maybe as minor as, you know, being asked to put something away, asked to come to dinner, stop what they're doing and come over, and they may just kind of, you know, lose it and air quotes overreact. So that would be the cerebellum. And here's important because now we're talking about some developmental anomalies or differences. So you can have a child or a person kind of, again, over, air quotes on the over, because we're not being judgmental, we're being descriptive, that they over respond to a sensory input. So those are the folks who would get irritated, overly so, by tags in their shirt. I have patients who are irritated by the seams in their clothes and their clothes, their socks, and some of them kind of refuse to wear certain types of clothing because of the response it brings up in them. There's too much response. And so, meaning that there's what we could call an expected or a normal, we want to use those words safely, but there's a normal level of response, and folks can be overstimulated by it. Being a little irritated by a shirt tag, you can kind of fix your shirt and be done with it, whereas someone who is over-responsive to the tag in the shirt is, again, throwing themselves down on the floor and having a bad moment. So again, cerebellum, we're talking about regulating emotion. Now there's another researcher, Dr. Ito, and he kind of furthers this conversation in terms of talking about how cerebellum's involved in the rate, rhythm, and force, but of cognition, kind of how we think, how we organize our ideas, how we put things, now we're talking about executive functioning, how we put things into order in terms of how we're going to do things. So now that gets pretty complex. He also talks about the cerebellum in a looped connection to the orbital frontal cortex, and again, we're kind of going to throw in some high Scrabble point words, but orbital frontal cortex has to do with still emotion, but also has to do with motivation, reward value. You can be over-motivated to do things, and now we're talking about someone who has very high drive, and sometimes that's a positive, but sometimes you can have too much drive, you're too expansive, you're too activated, and other people are the other way, they're under-motivated. And we can start thinking about some clinical language or some diagnostic language. This talk isn't about making diagnoses as much as kind of exploring what's going on in the brain when these things happen, but now we're starting to talk about a bipolar type of syndrome where you're over motivated, under motivated. Certainly depression of course falls in that category. And so the point here is that there's a brain structure in the back of the head. It regulates behavior, it regulates emotion, it regulates thinking, executive functioning, sequencing, motivation, emotional drive, and we can apply some of these findings to, again, different psychiatric diagnosis. And why do you kind of want to know about the structure, knowing simply, hey, we know we have these conditions, what are we going to do about it? That's what you're here for, probably. And so what you do about it, cerebellum regulates all of these things. And if we're kind of talk about emotions, yes, there's emotional care available. You can go to counseling, you can go to psychiatry, and sometimes medications are necessary to help regulate some of these emotional symptoms, absolutely. You can go to executive function coaching. There's computer applications to help with organization, keeping things on task, ordering what you're going to do, of course. There's occupational therapy. I think this is an underused service, and occupational therapy goes back to some of the earlier understandings of how the cerebellum works. Occupational therapy is having you interact and doing different hands-on, in the moment, in real life actions, doing things like balance beams and other, don't want to minimize the field because there's so much to it, but doing a lot of different physical activities to help the cerebellum develop, help it exercise, help it get stronger, help it with what it's there to do, which is anticipate, help adapt basically to your environment. And so I'll say it in a small bit here that the cerebellum has, I mentioned earlier about some feedback loops, and I don't want to get too far off the rails into the neuroscience jargon, but the cerebellum kind of brings in what it already knows to a situation to help predict how to respond. If you've caught a ball in the past, you know how to catch a ball in general, and so you know to put your hand out, probably in front of your face or where the object is coming in, and you know that this motor program of holding your hand up to catch a ball is a general kind of response to a ball being thrown at you. So that is the feed forward loop, and again, just using a couple jargony things, but it's what you bring to the situation. And then there's a feedback loop, which is calculating the sensory information coming in. So if a ball is thrown at you, there's a visual input. Your muscles, your joints, your body is trying to orient itself into space, so it's adjusting, it's learning, it's reacting to the stimuli coming in. And so kind of this process of learning, so taking the sensory input, calculating it, adjusting and correcting for errors, the feedback, and then the program that's brought to the table in terms of this now newly learned activity. So the more practice, in essence, that happens, the better predictive ability the cerebellum has. And so that's important to know, because that's how occupational therapy functions, is it has you work these sensory predictions, like it helps you kind of adapt to environments in different scenarios, different things that are important for you to be doing. Kids in school, they write, and so it helps them learn how to sense a pencil and use their vision to write, and using the rate, rhythm, and force properly, using the muscles and joints properly, taking the sensory input of, hey, this is too strong, let me lighten up. And so all of that practice helps develop predictability, develop these activities we need to learn, helps develop the cerebellum in essence. And the point being, what I was kind of referring to all along, is that if we can strengthen the cerebellum to correct our behavior prediction, our behavior programs, and our motor control, and our motor smoothness and quickness, like the more we learn, the quicker we can be, and more regulated. So it's not always quick as much as regulated, but the point of quick is that quick learning. Like you can, if you have memorized a program really well because you've practiced a zillion times, then your ability to catch from different angles is going to be a lot smoother, a lot less effortful, which leaves your attention and your other cognitive systems available to simultaneously do other things, like see that someone's trying to steal the base and you throw it quickly at them. So helps you correct the behavioral smoothness, but it also, if you're strengthening the cerebellum, can help you strengthen your emotional smoothness, your emotional regulation. And that's important because yes, there's certainly medications for emotional smoothness, emotional regulation, but you know, what if you've tried a bunch and they're not working? What if you have a smaller child and you're kind of not feeling right about medications yet? Maybe you've tried things and they haven't worked. So point being is that there's this physical structure in the brain that you can exercise to make better. And you know, while it's common knowledge, you know, that yeah, hey, go out and be physical in the environment, exercise, you're going to feel better, that's all true. But this is kind of taking it a step further, where if you exercise that brain structure, you might also get better emotional regulation, and that's absolutely the point. And again, not just helping with the emotions, but also help with executive functioning. So again, cerebellum's looped into a frontal brain structure. The front of our brain's involved in executive functioning, which is what I mentioned earlier: planning, organization, decision-making, executing responses properly, putting things into a stepwise order to accomplish things, and all the things we want to do, you know, with our life. The other kind of side point here that I hadn't mentioned is cerebellum's also involved in social interaction, meaning you want to regulate your social responses. So you might apply too much force to a social situation, not enough force. Your language and speech could very well be dysregulated. In social situations, you have to pause, listen, take that sensory input, and then apply responses in real time, and that can be disconnected. There can be some out of sync going on socially. And so again, occupational therapy can help with that synchrony. Point being is that you have to interact with the world in real life. And if you do not interact with the world in real life in 3D, I'll say, where you're practicing sensory input, again, we're talking about these feedback loops, you're taking in information, your cerebellum's adjusting and learning, and then developing a new response, and then using that new response next time as it learns. And so unless we're interacting in these real life situations, the cerebellum is going to be underdeveloped per se. And so it's ultra important to get out and do things certainly under the supervision of an occupational therapist, but also any of the other things we get out and do, get out and interact with nature, get out and do sports, of course. The point being, we want to develop those functions of the cerebellum in order to adapt, because again, you know, these are, if we're talking about some childhood things, these are things we want to develop, so once we get to college and beyond, that we have some tools available to survive, so that we can be independent and go on our own. And so again, it requires kind of this bedrock or this underpinning of proper motor development, cerebellar development, to eventually have effective cognitive, emotional, and social development. If you haven't figured it out, cerebellum is absolutely involved in developmental disorders in general, but also involved in autism spectrum. So absolutely having those brain regions strengthened can only improve how someone gets in sync with the world, because that's kind of the feel you get with an autism person diagnosed, that they have learned things, they learn behaviors, learned emotions, they have these products, but they don't always apply them properly or evenly regulated in real life. And so there's a disconnect or dysregulation, a dysynchrony, if that's a word. And that's what we want to focus on. And so again, having kind of maybe this kind of holistic approach toward some of these things can be beneficial. So not just medication alone, not just talk therapy alone, all of these things are fantastic, but it's also having that real world physical back and forth interaction that develops these important brain structures that help us grow and learn. Okay, so that's all I got for today, and we'll keep working at this.